The U.S. is in full meltdown mode right now as Iran escalates its aggression against the United States, and it's trying to bring down Israel as it runs for the gates. I'll have all the details coming up on In Focus. Over the past several days, news reports in Israel have been dominated by talk about a pending hostage deal that's being negotiated by Qatar, Egypt, and the United States with Hamas, with Israeli involvement. The outlines of the deal were reportedly reached during a meeting with Mossad Director Dedi Barnea in Paris, along with interlocutors from Qatar and Egypt and the United States under the aegis of CIA Director William Burns. The deal talks about a three-stage plan for the release of the hostages. In the first stage, Hamas is supposed to release all hostages age 60 and up, along with hostages that are critically wounded. In the second stage, they're supposed to release our soldiers, male and female. And in the third stage, they're supposed to release all of the bodies of the Israelis that they've murdered that they're holding in Gaza. The deal is supposed to last for a few months, perhaps 2 months, perhaps more, perhaps less. It's not clear. And during that time, Israel is supposed to allow massive so-called humanitarian aid to enter Gaza, perhaps along the lines of an earlier American demand that Israel even allow the reinstatement of commercial activity in Gaza. And then Israel says that it will reinstate its hostilities. But according to a report in a Qatari paper citing an Egyptian negotiator, the Egyptians are claiming that actually the deal is a trap to force Israel to end the war in defeat. The Egyptian official told the Qatari newspaper that Egypt and Qatar are giving Hamas U.S.-backed guarantees that at the end of the so-called ceasefire or the hostage deal, when all of the bodies in the third stage are supposed to be released, that the United States is going to bar Israel from reinstating its military operations against Hamas and essentially allow Hamas to survive this war and so win it by default. The hostages for terrorist swap is also something quite extraordinary. They're saying that for every Israeli hostage release, that Israel is supposed to release 100 between 100 and 250 Palestinian terrorists from its prisons. So we're talking including about the murderers from October 7th and other mass murderers of Israelis that are imprisoned in Israeli jails on life sentences, and many of them multiple life sentences. And also, again, the rapists, the murderers who carried out the slaughter of October 7th. So the Americans are pushing full speed ahead with this deal. I think it was National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan met with Qatari Prime Minister Thani in the White House this week. Jake Sullivan met with hostages' families and others, and they're putting maximum pressure on the Netanyahu government to accept the deal. Netanyahu, for his part, rejected it in a speech at Eli military yeshiva at Eli that has already lost, I think, 15 of its graduates in the fighting in Gaza over the past 3 months. Netanyahu gave a speech where he recommitted to fighting the war to full victory, and then he had the following to say.
אני שומע אמירות על כל מיני עסקאות, אז אני רוצה להבהיר. אנחנו לא נסיים את המלחמה הזאת עם פחות מהשגת כל יעדיה. וזה אומר חיסול החמאס, החזרת כל חטופינו, והבטחה שעזה לא תהווה עוד איום על ישראל. אנחנו לא נוציא את צה"ל מרצועת עזה, ואנחנו לא נשחרר אלפי מחבלים.
After Netanyahu gave his remarks, National Security Council spokesman James Kirby gave us a press conference. And during the course of this press conference, he was asked about Netanyahu's rejection of the deal that the United States is advancing. And Kirby's response was, I would say, nothing less than extraordinary. He said, the prime minister can speak for himself. We don't need to change directions. In other words, we don't care what the prime minister of Israel says. We're moving full speed ahead. And the other thing that's so shocking about this statement is that Kirby is essentially saying that the prime minister is only speaking for himself, when in fact he's speaking for the Israeli public. A survey that was taken by Channel 14 last week showed that 65% of Israelis reject the terms of the deal that are being put forward now. Israelis reject the idea of releasing the terrorists from all the terrorists from Israeli prisons, the Hamas murderers in Israeli prisons, in exchange for the hostages. So we're talking about a deal that Netanyahu is very clearly speaking for the vast majority of Israelis when he rejects it. And the American government is saying, no, we don't care what he says. We're moving full speed ahead. While the Egyptians are saying that this entire thing is a trap, that the whole purpose of it is to coerce Israel into accepting strategic defeat at the hands of Hamas. And just to be clear, we've talked about it in the past, but the implications of an Israeli pullout from Gaza without Hamas being first destroyed, and in fact leaving Gaza at all, and so enabling Hamas to reconstitute itself, would be a cataclysmic defeat for Israel. Not only would it enable again Hamas to regenerate its forces, rebuild and attack again, just as all of its leaders have pledged to do, it also invites aggression from Hamas's Houthi, Hezbollah partners in the Iranian axis, and of course it gives a huge invitation to Iran to move full speed ahead with its aims to assert hegemonic control over the entire Middle East and to wipe Israel off the map, as it's always promised to do since the 1979 Islamic Revolution. So what the United States is demanding that Israel do is accept a strategic defeat that imperils its existence in the short term, not in 50 years hence, but tomorrow. And the interesting thing about the American pressure on Israel to collapse and accept a ceasefire, and by the way, where will these terrorists be released to? Well, most of them will be released to Judea and Samaria. So you're talking about bringing thousands of hardened, convicted terrorist murderers into Israel's heartland. And so just that in and of itself, the release of these terrorists into Judea and Samaria, again, guarantees that we're going to have another October 7th, but orders of magnitude greater in the Israeli communities in Judea and Samaria and in Israel cities throughout central Israel that also are just, in many cases, hundreds of meters, like Kfar Saba, from Judea and Samaria. So we're talking about inviting all of Israel or terrorists to come into all of Israel and endanger the lives of thousands and thousands and thousands of Israelis. Just this week, I think it was on Monday night, IDF Special Forces conducted a pretty amazing raid on a hospital in Jenin, and they killed 3 or 4 hostages from Hamas and Islamic Jihad that were in the final stages of planning an October 7th-like attack on Israeli communities in Judea and Samaria. And this is not the first time that it's happened. The motivation among terrorists, and there are thousands and thousands and thousands of them in Judea and Samaria, including U.S.-funded, trained, and armed Palestinian security services of the PA that the United States funds. The motivation among all of these forces to reenact October 7th, both in the communities in Judea and Samaria of Israelis, where 500,000 Israelis live, and also in central Israel, in the areas abutting Judea and Samaria and beyond them, is sky high. It's unprecedented. When we say that over 90% of Palestinians support or feel prouder of being Palestinians after October 7th than they ever did before, it's because October 7th infused them with the belief that they are, in fact, on their way to achieving their strategic goal as a society, which is the annihilation of Israel, the genocide of the Jews. And so the motivation among Palestinians in Judea and Samaria to reenact the October 7th massacre, but on a far greater scale, is enormous. And if Israel were to be stupid enough to accept the deal that the United States is trying to force down its throat, then we would be guaranteeing that that would happen by bringing thousands of terrorist murderers into our heartland. And again, just massively increasing the already unprecedentedly high motivation and faith of the Palestinians that they are on their way to conquering Jerusalem, to annihilating the Jews. And all of this is happening while Iran is massively stepping up its attacks on the United States. This week, you had an Iranian drone that was launched against U.S. forces in Jordan, along the tri-border area of Jordan, Syria, and Iraq, where they are responsible for controlling the critical land border between Iraq and Syria that Iran seeks to use to flood Syria and Lebanon with advanced weapons and thousands of Shiite forces, terrorists, including from Afghanistan and from other countries that they want to flood into the region in order to invade Israel. So the U.S. forces there along the border, the main base is a Tanf air base, but the Jordanian base that was attacked is just, a few kilometers away from that. On the Jordanian side of the border, they attacked it with an advanced drone. 3 American soldiers were killed in their sleep while they were asleep. And the American response to this has been, and not nice to say, but it's been let's call things by their names. It's been extremely cowardly. So let me just give you a couple of quotes from a CNN write-up of the United States' response to the killing of 3 of their soldiers by this was done directly by what's called the Hezbollah Kutaib, which is an Iranian Shiite, an Iraqi militia of Shiites that is beholden to Iran. So Kirby said on Monday, "We don't seek a war with Iran. We're not looking for a wider conflict in the Middle East. In fact, every action the president has taken has been designed to de-escalate, to try to bring the tensions down." So here you have 3 Americans who were killed, and the White House, the National Security Council, responds by saying, we want to de-escalate. We don't want to escalate. So any American response to the wanton murder of 3 of our soldiers is going to be de-escalatory. We're not going to take serious action because we don't want to get further engaged in war. And then a U.S. official who was not speaking under his name said in the same report, he said, "I don't think this was intended as an escalation. It is the same type of attack they've done 163 times before, and on 164 they get lucky." So I just want to break down this response. So first of all, we have to remember that indeed Iranian-backed forces from Yemen, from Syria, from Iraq have attacked American forces in the region 164 times since October 7th. So this is a constant attack. This is more than once a day, right? And so here they are attacking the United States every day, day in and day out, and the United States has basically not responded in any serious way. Even the Houthis' aggression on the Red Sea, blocking a major maritime route for civilian and military traffic. The United States has responded only against the points of aggression. So it's taken a few assaults on Yemen itself, to be sure, but it gave the Houthis so much advance warning that the attacks were coming, they were able to move most of their personnel and significant assets away from the areas that the United States attacked. And the United States continues to focus its efforts on intercepting missiles that have already been launched against maritime traffic in the Red Sea, which is just shocking. It's completely defensive. It's not going after the Houthis. It's not bombing their port. It's not bombing the Iranian spy ship that's directing all of the assaults on maritime traffic in the Red Sea. And it's, of course, blocking Israel, demanding that Israel do nothing, essentially, against the effective embargo, the effective maritime blockade that the Houthis have enacted illegally against Israel's Red Sea port in Eilat by blocking the traffic on the Bab el-Mandeb. So that's what the United States has been doing. And then what the unnamed official said was, well, they've attacked us so many times and now they just got lucky. It's the same thing. But what actually the after-action analysis of the drone attack showed that this attack was significantly more advanced than its previous ones. In other words, the attack itself, which was lethal and successful, was so successful because it was so sophisticated. And here I'm just going to give you the write-up here from CNN. It says the attack bore many of the hallmarks of the previous 160-plus strikes by Iranian-backed militias, officials said, the only difference being that this one successfully hit a housing container at a U.S. base early on Sunday. Then here. That's one thing, so it hit. But the second thing that makes a difference is that the drone also flew low, potentially allowing it to evade the base's air defenses and approached the base around the same time as an American drone that was returning from mission. That likely caused confusion and may have delayed a response. So what's so interesting here is that what they're showing is that this is an incredibly sophisticated attack. What Iran did with this drone, or the Hezbollah, Kutaib Hezbollah, or whatever, this Iraqi militia that's completely controlled and directed and armed and trained by Iran, but the Americans like to pretend that Iran wasn't responsible because they think that, well, maybe they didn't know, maybe this wholly owned consortium of Iran is somehow or another acting independently when it kills 3 American soldiers in their sleep. But the thing is that this drone simply tailed, like right on the tail of an American drone that was returning to its base after completing the mission. And as a result of sort of just following this drone, it confused the American radars so that they weren't able to detect that there were actually 2 drones flying in tandem when they thought it was only one. So this is somebody who has learned the lessons of the failures of previous assaults. So 160 plus drone assaults on the United States didn't lead to deaths of U.S. servicemen, but here this one did because they were learning from their mistakes. The Iranians are learning on the battlefield. The battlefield experience with their drones is what enabled this one to succeed. So when you say it wasn't qualitatively different, what you see is that all of the previous ones that didn't lead to American fatalities are considered failures by the Iranians, and they were trying to learn what they were doing wrong so that they could succeed. And of course they did here. Not only were 3 American soldiers killed, but I think, 30 of them, or more than 30 of them, were wounded, some critically, by the attack on their barracks. So, and here's the Biden administration callously saying, well, there's nothing new here except that it succeeded where the other ones failed, so there's no reason for us to make a major escalation as a result. And then, and indeed, with the plausible deniability, the blessed plausible deniability of Iran that the United States keeps using really since October 7th, even though it's clear that Hamas's assault on Israel and the massacre of Israelis, the rape of Israelis, etc., the taking of hostages was all pre-planned with Iran in Beirut, as the Wall Street Journal reported around, right after October 7th. And actually, reports had come out in the months before about coordination meetings going on in Beirut between Hamas, terror masters, Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps leaders, and Hezbollah, so that it was all being coordinated and planned jointly. And a lot of the Hamas terrorists were receiving paragliding training in Beirut at the hands of Hezbollah. So all of these things were planned and coordinated in advance by Iran, Hezbollah, and Hamas in Beirut. The United States says that they have no evidence clearly marking that Iran was involved in planning of this. So it's always accepting this or embracing this idea that Iran might not have been responsible because there were no Iranians involved in the actual attacks. Although here too, residents of the kibbutzim who were attacked on October 7th said that several of the people there were speaking in Farsi and not in Arabic, meaning that there may very well have been Iranian operatives on the ground in Israel involved with the actual massacre. All that said, the United States continues on with this. The Biden administration does. Deputy Pentagon Spokeswoman Sabrina Singh said on Monday, "We know these groups are supported by Iran, and therefore they do have their fingerprints on this, but I can't tell you more in terms of who directed it." I know Iran might be involved, but then again, it might not be, and so we're not going to do anything about it. And, this led this man, John Alterman, the Middle East Program Director at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, to explain that really the United States is deterring itself here, that United States is all of the explanations and analyses that they're doing in order to explain away Iran's bald, naked aggression against the United States and its allies throughout the Middle East is not actually being done by Iran because they don't want to actually do anything on Iran. He says, every message you see talks about fear of escalation from the administration. We have managed to deter ourselves here. He also said, in the last 3 months, Iran has benefited profoundly from its years of investment in the axis of resistance. If everything is deliberate and proportionate, it creates an incentive for people to go right up to the red line and to make sure they know exactly where that red line is. So Iran is benefiting from America's timidity, America's insistence on not doing anything, but it actually gets worse than that, because after America showed very clearly that it does not want in any way, shape, or form to take any action against Iran, which is warring against the United States and directing a war for the annihilation of America's closest ally in the Middle East, Israel. The Hezbollah Qutayb in Iraq said, well, we're going to stand down. We're going to stop attacking the United States, which may sound like they're deterred, but the exact opposite is the case, because Sky News in Arabic said that actually, no, Qutayb Hezbollah only said that they were going to stand down because, according to this Arab media outlet, Sky News in Arabic, they reported suspicion of Qutayb Hezbollah attacks against the U.S. is now said to be linked to negotiations over a U.S. withdrawal from Iraq, according to an advisor to the Iraqi prime minister. So all of this is part of a deal that the Americans are trying to make with Iran, that if the United States stands down and forces Israel into strategic defeat with Hamas, then Iran and its proxies will stop attacking the United States, and the United States will withdraw its forces from Iraq, and who knows, from Syria as well. There have been rumors that they also want to leave Syria. So the United States, Biden, wants to remove American forces in humiliation from Iraq and from Syria under attack, under fire from Iran's proxies. They want to cut a deal with Iran. This sounds very familiar because obviously this is what they did with the Taliban in Afghanistan. And they want to cut a deal and they want to run away. And the price they're willing to pay for this deal is a humiliating, strategic, colossal defeat for Israel, from which Israel will never be able to recuperate because it invites this massive aggression to continue to escalate. So that's what the United States wants to do. And the weird thing about it is that, it's not enough that the United States is trying to push Israel through this hostage deal to collapse. It's also that the hostage deal itself, from the American perspective, from the Biden administration perspective, is also in the service of advancing another key American objective as outlined by the Biden administration in November of 2022, for that matter, which is to oust Netanyahu and the right wing from power and to replace them with a supplicant left-wing Israeli government that's going to support the establishment of a Palestinian state and the assertion of power by the Palestinian Authority, the terrorist authority the United States supports in Judea and Samaria, in the Gaza Strip as well. And again, this Palestinian Authority wants to form a unity government with Hamas. So the reconstitution of Hamas as part of the PLO in a unity government with the PA, Israeli strategic humiliation and collapse, American withdrawal from the Middle East, and through the ouster of the elected government of a fellow democracy and a U.S. ally, Israel. So it's interesting because, we've talked in the past about how the administration is talking about openly the day after, and their media spokesman, Tom Friedman from the New York Times, was talking about how he was working to convince the Saudis to make conditions on a normalization deal with Israel that would include concessions to the Palestinians that the Netanyahu government cannot possibly accept and survive. So he wants to oust the Netanyahu government from power, which Tom Friedman referred to the government as an existential threat to Israel. Thank you very much, Tom Friedman, for telling us what's an existential threat. Iran, nuclear, not an existential threat. Palestinian terrorist state in our heartland, not an existential threat. What is an existential threat? Israelis who you don't like. That's what the existential threat is. Israelis whose politics you don't approve of, whose politics are not suicidal. You don't like them, and if they're not, and if they're in charge, that's the existential threat you view facing Israel. So what's really notable about this is that this operation to oust the Israeli government is being done in cahoots not only with the Israeli left, which has been announcing over the past several days that they're going to reinstate their anti-government demonstrations, protests, riots that were going on in Israel in the 10 months preceding the October 7th slaughters. But it also seems to be carried out in coordination with Hamas. And this is actually one of the interesting things that we've learned over the past couple of weeks. I think it was Sunday night, it might have been Monday night, that Channel 12's crack reporter Amit Segal revealed that in the course of IDF operations in Khan Yunis, they came upon a recently abandoned command post. And at that command post, where they believe that Yahya Sinwar, Hamas's terror master in Gaza, the architect of the October 7th slaughter, had been located. And they found this document, which was clearly written by the leadership, because it was all based on strategic war aims. So that's not something that you get, say, from a battalion commander who's only concerned about preserving his forces and attacking IDF forces on the ground in his area of operations. But these are actually larger goals. So the goals laid out were the basic components of Hamas's psychological operation against Israel. And we have to understand that the hostage taking, of course, itself is a strategic psychological operation against Israel. It's meant to demoralize us and collapse our will to fight and force us to do what the United States is trying to get us to do, which is to capitulate in order to get back our hostages. So Hamas, it said in the document, there are, I think, 4 components of its psychological operation against Israel. The first one, and this is the instructions to the Hamas senior leadership on this document. It's called the instructions document. It says, increase the distribution of videos and photos of hostages because of due to the psychological pressure they create. So over the weekend, last weekend, we got the Hamas released a video of 3 female hostages, 2 soldiers and 1 30-year-old hostage, Dolan Steinberger, and the 3 women were all speaking in unison. It was all very clearly choreographed, blaming Netanyahu, saying that Hamas cared about them more than Israel did and demanded that Israel end the war and bring them home. And this was a choreographed message. They were speaking in unison. They all had the same hand movement, so it was clearly all dictated to them by their captors. And they looked like they were in distress. And they also looked very angry. And they looked like they were being told what to say. And it was demoralizing to watch it. It really was. It was very demoralizing to watch it. And so the idea is to put out as many of these as possible to keep the psychological pressure on the public, on the leadership, to try to force us into strategic collapse and capitulation. The second thing that the document said was do everything possible to increase psychological pressure on Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, who they identify as the weakest link in Netanyahu's governmental armor, because for whatever reason, and maybe we'll talk about it in a future program, they've identified Defense Minister Yoav Gallant as a weak link, and that they can apply psychological pressure to him specifically, directed at him specifically, to break him, to make him fold. He already is sort of folding. He's trying to bring Benny Gantz and Gadi Eisenkot into the government as full cabinet ministers rather than ministers without portfolios, and to get them to stay in so that they essentially have veto power over all decision-making by Netanyahu, something that the Likud won't accept. And so he's sort of putting himself monkey in the middle and no longer representing the will of the Likud voters, but rather more of the general staff, which has been, from the outset, as I wrote last week, been seeking capitulation. You can read about that in my article, Israel's Isolated Generals. The third one is to continue the claim that Netanyahu is responsible for everything that happened. So here, too, we see the United States. What did Jim Kirby say? He said Netanyahu can speak for himself, right? But he doesn't speak for Israel. That's what the Americans just by fiat decided, that the fact that he actually does represent the people of Israel is of no weight, because, the Israeli elites, the ruling class of Israel and the general staff and in the media, the judiciary, etc., they hate him, and therefore he has no power. I mean, that's essentially the upshot of what the Americans said. And then the last thing that the Hamas document said, and again, that telegraphs, that goes directly, that converges with the messaging of the Israeli left, that is saying that Netanyahu is solely responsible for what happened on October 7th, the IDF, everything, it was great. The intelligence failures, they had all the information. They didn't share it with Netanyahu, but it's all his fault, obviously, because of the judicial reform or whatever, that they didn't organize in terms of what Hamas was planning. They instead decided that Hamas was deterred because they wanted it to be, and they didn't wake up the soldiers at dawn to guard and so be awake and be capable of fending off the Hamas assault at 6:30 in the morning. But it's all Netanyahu's fault. And then the last thing that they said is to undermine the Israeli narrative that the ground operation serves the goal of freeing the hostages. So the idea is that you go after the leader, you increase psychological pressure on Gallant, who they identify as a weak link, you release hostage videos and photos in order to exert psychological pressure on Israel, and you reject Israel's claim, which is true, which is that the more we militarily defeat them, the closer we come to securing the release of the hostages, either by reaching them and rescuing them or by compelling Hamas to give them up in exchange for air, food, water. But of course, the United States wants to see to it that they always have all of those things by forcing Israel to continue the steady stream of humanitarian aid to Hamas, which, as I think I mentioned, Ronen Bar, the head of Shin Bet, told the government last week that 60 to 70% of that humanitarian aid goes directly to Hamas. So this is what the Americans doing. Now, what is the chance that this is actually going to succeed? The truth is, I don't think it's very high. I don't think the United States can run away from the Middle East and get some sort of outcome that's going to be solicitous to either Biden as he seeks re-election in November, or any Democrat who may replace him if such a scenario were to ensue in some way. And it certainly is going to endanger the United States. And it's also not going to be accepted by Israel. And so here I just want to say that when the United States makes these plans, they're making these plans without paying attention or being willing to countenance or think at all or attribute any significance to the interests and the goals of the actors in the region. And I'll just go through three of them, the three main ones that should be interesting for the United States. The first one is Iran. Iran declared war on the United States at the outset of the Iranian Revolution in 1979, and it has been waging continuous war against the United States directly and through its proxies ever since. It seeks openly the annihilation of the United States, and when the United States isn't in the region, Iran sends its terrorists to actually kill the United States outside of the region. For instance, 11 out of the 15 hijackers on 9/11 traveled through Tehran, traveled through Iran on their way to the United States to carry out the hijacking of the flights. This was information that was uncovered by the 9/11 Commission. The United States never wanted to look into it because they didn't want to deal with the fact that it was, in fact, Iran playing a key role in the organization, in the planning, in the underwriting, in the training for the 9/11 attacks on the United States. Because the United States has always, since 1979, been a conflict averse to Iran. And in the meantime, rather than standing down and agreeing to be appeased throughout all of these intervening 45 years, the Iranians have only expanded their capacities, their capabilities, pocketed all of America's concessions, all of its goodwill gestures to the Ayatollahs, used the money, the billions and billions of dollars that the United States has enabled Iran to get its fingers on, to expand their nuclear weapons program, to expand their terror nexus, not only throughout the region, but throughout the world. Just look at Iran's strategic ties with the Bolivarian regimes in Latin America, from Venezuela to Bolivia, and now into Chile and others that have become all anti-American just over the past 20 years. And all Iranian allies right there in the Western Hemisphere, facing the United States, including Nicaragua. So they have built this massive terror nexus throughout the Middle East, in Europe, and in Latin America, and in some cases in North America as well. And when you look at the breached border with Mexico, you can only imagine how many Iranian-backed terrorists have already entered into the United States, so that if the United States thinks that it can run away from Iran and secure some sort of deal by pulling out its forces from Syria and Iraq in humiliation in the face of Iran's stepped-up aggression, and also undermine Israel and leave it open to massive Iranian war, aggression, invasion, and annihilation, Iran will just come to the United States. It's already poised to do so. So you can only believe that it's possible to appease Iran if you pay no attention to what Iran says and what it does. And one of the things that we learned on October 7th is that all of these declarations, the desire to engage in mass murder, annihilation, genocide of Israel and the Jews, was serious. They did exactly what they've been promising that they would do. And anybody who doesn't take their word seriously after October 7th is just being irresponsible with his life and with the lives of everybody that he loves, and with the existence of his country. And the same goes for the United States. There is no reason for anybody to believe for even a second that Iran's pledges to annihilate the United States are unserious. They're serious. Now, what do we see? That the Iranians had engaged this past week. It just came out that the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps had engaged motorcycle gangs in the United States to carry out assassinations of Iranian dissidents in Washington. Actually, they didn't say in the report that I saw who it was that the motorcycle gangs or whatever were supposed to assassinate. It could just as easily have been former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, former National Security Advisor John Bolton, who are both being, they both have bodyguards 24/7 because they're under threats to their lives at the hands of Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps. So, they're arrested for plotting the assassination of Americans on American soil, and again, not for the first time. So you can run, but you can't hide. They'll come after you because they're serious. The second thing it doesn't take into account, so Iran, the Biden administration refuses to understand what Iran is. The second thing they refuse to understand is the Sunnis. If the United States actually compels Israel to capitulate and to leave itself open for mass invasion, it's not going to bring the Sunnis into the American corner. It's going to push them even further into the Chinese and Russian corner, because the Americans are going to destroy what's left of their position as a superpower in the region. People are simply not going to take them. They already ruined their credibility by trying to re-engage in the appeasement of Iran of the Obama administration, Biden and his advisors, when they came into office in 2021, and essentially going to war against Saudi Arabia and Israel. But to the extent that anybody had any sort of lingering trust in America, that's all going to dissipate completely, and the Sunnis are just they already are. They're going to realign towards China, towards Iran, and towards Russia, and against the United States as a result of this. So it's going to be a calamity. It's going to destroy the United States' position as a superpower in the region and through the region throughout the world. It's going to endanger the United States' homeland by inviting aggression closer to home. We learned this in our little world when we ran away from Lebanon in 2000. Lebanon became, we ran away from Hezbollah in Lebanon, and then Hezbollah swallowed Lebanon, and now it's a threat facing Israel that's orders of magnitude greater than anything that we faced when we had our soldiers deployed in the security zone along our border with Lebanon. So you run, but if they're serious about killing you, they'll just become ever stronger and more capable of killing you in much larger numbers and much more effectively. And then the third group that thankfully the United States doesn't understand is Israel. They simply don't understand Israel. I remember I'm writing an article about this now, how in 2009, when Obama came into office and he faced Netanyahu, he came into office in January, and I think that Netanyahu returned to office after a decade out of power in March or April of 2009. And Rahm Emanuel, who was the White House chief of staff at the time, made some sort of snide claim to the effect of, well, we ousted Netanyahu from power a decade ago in 1999, and we'll just do it again if he gives us any trouble. And he believed that because he didn't understand that Israeli society had changed fundamentally between 2000 or 1999 and 2009, because in the intervening years, 1,500 Israelis had been butchered in the Palestinian terrorist war after the Palestinians rejected Israel's peace offer at the Camp David peace summit in July of 2000 under Clinton, and declared jihad on Israel and joined forces with Hamas and Islamic Jihad and began massacring Israelis in all of Israel's major cities and towns and highways with suicide bombers and roadside bombs and all the rest of it. So Israelis, after that experience, were not at all interested in the same song and dance about peace and Palestinian statehood from 2000 or from 1999 put forward in 2009. And so he thought that they were going to be able to oust Netanyahu in 2009, and they didn't, because the Israelis people weren't interested in what they were selling. And in fact, the more openly hostile Obama and his advisors became towards Israel and towards Netanyahu, the stronger his position became in Israeli public. And you see the same thing happening today, that, you look at the opinion polls, and I don't know if I think I cited it at the outset of this week, but I'm not sure, that Channel 14 published a poll last week that showed that all of these polls that are being put out by the left-wing media in Israel, claiming that Benny Gantz and his National Stateliness Party, or whatever stupid name it has in English, that they're now getting double the number of mandates as Likud. They found that is simply not true, that Likud is now at 27 mandates and that Benny Gantz is at 26. Netanyahu is leading Gantz in favorability for prime minister, I think, by 8 points, and leading Yair Lapid, the head of the opposition and the former interim prime minister, by 16 points. So Israelis are actually coming back to Netanyahu. They're rallying around the leader who's refusing to bow to any of this American pressure. And 63% oppose a Palestinian state. 65%, as I said, oppose a hostage deal. Only 28% approve. 72% oppose humanitarian aid to the Palestinians so long as the hostages remain in captivity. Only 21% of Israelis support it. And, in an interview with Douglas Murray, who was on this show at the outset of this war, when he first came to Israel, and he's been doing fantastic work since then, this week he interviewed Prime Minister Netanyahu for Talk TV, I think it's called, and you should all check it out on YouTube. And Netanyahu said, Douglas asked him, well, what happens if you have to go to war in the north without anybody standing with you? And he said, well, then we'll stand alone. Israel will stand, even if it means standing alone. We have things that we have to do. We have to defeat our enemies in the north and the south, and we will, because we don't have any other choice. If we can get Hezbollah to somehow or another be persuaded to remove its forces from the border, maybe that's a good diplomatic solution, but that doesn't seem to be in the offing, and therefore we're going to have to fight in the north. So I think, the idea here is that the Americans want something very badly. They think that they can get it, but the only reason that they think that they can get it is because they're completely deluding themselves about the nature of the conflict that is afflicting it as the superpower in the region, as the head of the alliance of democracies, the axis of democracies facing the axis of jihad led by Iran, which is also supported by China and Russia. And it doesn't want to see it because, you have the progressives in the United States, and Biden and Blinken are afraid of getting them angry going into the election. And because they generally are, particularly, I think, Blinken at this point has become unmistakable, exceedingly hostile towards Israel. They only talk to Israeli leftists, apparently, so they don't understand the nature of Israeli society, that the Israeli people, the Jewish people, are committed completely to our continued existence, and we're not going to stand down. And we will stand and we'll fight. Today, Mothers of IDF Warriors, a couple of weeks ago, I had two representatives of this fantastic organization of Israeli mama bears. They had a demonstration outside of the U.S. Embassy. They sent a letter to President Biden last week. We did a write-up of it at JNS. They had a big protest outside of the U.S. Embassy. Here you can see some of the pictures, where they said, "We demand that you stop pressuring Israel to give humanitarian aid to the Palestinians. It's all it is resupply for Hamas, and it endangers our children who are fighting and willing to give their lives in battle. But why should we unnecessarily place their lives at risk? That's what you're doing by prolonging Hamas's ability to survive, by forcing Israel to resupply this terrorist organization that seeks the annihilation of the Jewish people." That is the Biden administration's policy. So, these kinds of Israelis who are willing to get up, in the morning, try to block humanitarian aid convoys, and be arrested for doing so, to stop resupply of Hamas at all the crossing points into Gaza and in Ashdod port this morning, and mothers of IDF forces who are picketing the U.S. Embassy, I think for the first time it's ever happened, demanding that the United States stop pressuring Israel to make these kinds of insane concessions to our enemy, shows that, whether people like Netanyahu or they don't, they agree with him, and they stand with him when he stands for Israel. And so I think, this is destined to fail in a big flop. And also, as Netanyahu said, the American people support Israel, and survey data shows that. So we'll see what happens. But despite everything, the United States, if they want to disengage and defeat and invite aggression against the U.S. mainland from Iran and its proxies, they're free to do so. But Israel isn't going to follow them down this path. So those are my thoughts, and don't miss my interview today with Victor Davis Hanson, again from the Hoover Institute. Very excited that he's coming back to the show. See you later. Take care.